The night was calm as Thompson Flight 3894 taxied onto the runway, its engines humming with the familiar power of a Boeing 737. The flight, scheduled to take off from Malaga, Spain, en route to Manchester, England, carried 189 passengers, holidaymakers, returning home, some tired, some still reliving the warm Mediterranean sun. Captain Richard Lowe, a seasoned pilot with over 12,000 flight hours, sat in the left seat while First Officer Daniel Scott, younger but competent, prepared for departure. The aircraft, sleek and sturdy, seemed in perfect shape. But that was only the illusion before disaster struck. As the plane accelerated down the runway, everything seemed routine. The engines roared as the aircraft gained speed. V1, Daniel called out, confirming they had reached the point of no return. Rotate, Captain Lowe commanded. The nose lifted, and the Boeing 737 smoothly took to the sky, its wings slicing through the night air. Malaga's city lights shrank below them as they climbed. At 10,000 feet, Daniel retracted the landing gear. The aircraft was stable. The autopilot was engaged. But just as Captain Lowe reached for a sip of his coffee, a sudden violent jolt rattled the cockpit. The control yoke jerked under his grip. Warning chimes blared. The aircraft began an unexpected roll to the right. Whoa! What the hell was that? Daniel's voice shot up in alarm. The plane continued banking. The autopilot disengaged with a loud click, and the aircraft's nose pitched downward. The horizon tilted crazily in the windshield. The Boeing was no longer responding as it should. Captain Lowe grabbed the controls, forcing the yoke to the left, trying to counteract the yaw roll, but something was terribly wrong. The control column felt sluggish, unresponsive, as if the aircraft itself was resisting their commands. Mayday, Mayday. Thompson 3894, experiencing severe control issues, Lowe called out, his voice controlled but edged with tension. The air traffic controller responded immediately. Thompson 3894, say again your emergency. Lowe barely had time to reply. The aircraft had now entered a nose-down descent, its altitude rapidly dropping. The Boeing shuddered violently as if trapped. In an invisible grip, warning screamed through the cockpit. Stall warning, bank angle, overspeed. Conflicting alerts flooded their senses, a cacophony of danger. Passengers in the cabin, who had just settled in, were now gripping their armrests. Some gasped as they felt their stomachs drop with the aircraft's sudden descent. Others screamed. Flight attendants struggled to stay on their feet as the plane lurched unpredictably. Lowe fought the controls, his knuckles white against the yoke. We're losing control. What's happening? Daniel's hands flew across the overhead panel. Checking systems. Hydraulics are fine. Controls feel jammed. We might have a trim runaway. Trim runaway. An insidious failure where the aircraft's stabilizer deflects uncontrollably, forcing the nose down. If it was happening now, they had only seconds to react. Lowe knew the procedure. Cut out the trim, he ordered. Daniel reached for the stabilizer cutout switches and flipped them. But the aircraft was still in free fall, the ground rushing up at an alarming rate. Passengers in the cabin felt the terrifying weightlessness of the dive. Overhead compartments popped open, bags tumbling out. A mother clutched her child, her sobs lost in the chaos. A businessman gripped his seat, his face pale, lips moving in silent prayer. We need to pull up, Daniel shouted. Lowe and Daniel pulled with all their strength. The control column was stiff, unyielding. It was like trying to lift a car with bare hands. At 8,000 feet, they were still descending at over 4,000 feet per minute. If they couldn't cover soon, they wouldn't make it. And then, something changed. A sudden surge of control response. It wasn't much, but enough to fight back. Lowe pulled harder, his muscles burning with exertion. The nose inched up. The ground that had been filling their windshield shifted slightly downward. 1,000 feet. The control column loosened slightly, responding better. 1,000 feet. Come on, Lowe gritted his teeth. At 4,000 feet, they finally broke free. The aircraft leveled out, roaring forward instead of plummeting. G-forces pushed them into their seats as they arrested the descent. The cabin shook violently before finally stabilizing. For a moment, the cockpit was filled with only the sound of heavy breathing. "Jesus," Daniel muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "We almost lost it." Lowe exhaled slowly, his hands still trembling slightly as he kept control. "We need to land. Now." Agreed. They turned back toward Malaga, shaking but alive. But one question lingered in their minds. How did this happen? The Airbus A320, gleaming under the golden hues of the setting sun, was parked at Malaga Airport's busy tarmac. The Thompson Fly 3894 crew was finishing their pre-flight preparations, oblivious to the silent danger lurking within their aircraft. It was a routine flight, Manchester-bound, a route so familiar that both Captain Richard Lowe and First Officer Daniel Scott could have flown it blindfolded. Inside the cockpit, the usual hum of checklists and system verifications played out. Captain Lowe, a composed man with over 12,000 hours of flying experience, scanned the flight plan while sipping his coffee. Daniel, his younger but capable first officer, adjusted his headset and ran his fingers over the overhead panel. "Everything's looking solid," Daniel remarked, glancing at the instruments. "Weather's clear, no reported turbulence on the way." Lowe nodded. "Should be a smooth ride, let's push back." The aircraft began its slow, calculated reverse from the gate. Passengers settled in, fastening seatbelts, some already dozing off, while others scrolled through their phones, unaware of the impending chaos that would soon engulf their flight. The cabin crew moved efficiently through the aisles, performing safety checks. As the aircraft lined up on the taxiway, Lowe called for the engine start. With a deep mechanical growl, the CFM56 engines came to life. "Engine 1 stable. Engine 2 stable," Daniel confirmed. Lowe flexed his fingers over the throttle levers. "Good. Let's get to the runway." The aircraft rolled forward, the rhythmic sound of the taxiway lights passing beneath them adding to the hypnotic motion of takeoff preparation. Runway 13 was clear for departure. The control tower gave them the green light. "Thompson 3894, you are cleared for takeoff. Climb to flight level 350. Lowe acknowledged, his hands firm on the controls. "Cleared for takeoff, Thompson 3894. The engines roared as the throttles were pushed forward. The plane surged down the runway, increasing speed with every second. Daniel called out speeds. "V1, rotate." Lowe eased back on the yoke, and the aircraft's nose lifted gracefully into the evening sky. Malaga shrank below them, its city lights twinkling. "Positive rate. Gear up," Daniel called. "Gear up," Lowe confirmed. The aircraft climbed smoothly, the passengers settling into their seats as the familiar feeling of ascent filled the cabin. The flight seemed flawless, until it wasn't. A sudden, unexplained jerk. The Boeing 737 shuddered, just. Small tremor at first, but then another, stronger one followed. Lowe frowned, tightening his grip. "Did you feel that?" Daniel checked the instruments. "Yeah, it's not turbulence, something's off." Before Lowe could respond, the control yoke wrenched sharply to the right. The autopilot disengaged with a sharp click. The aircraft suddenly banked, hard. "What the?" Lowe grunted, trying to level the wings. The controls resisted, as if an invisible force had taken over the plane. The cockpit filled with warning sounds. Stall warning. Bank angle. Overspeed. Conflicting alarms blared simultaneously, adding to the confusion. The aircraft's nose pitched, down, the altimeter spinning backward. They were losing altitude. Fast, Daniel's fingers flew across the controls. "Something's wrong with the trim, it's not responding." Lowe fought the yoke with all his strength, sweat forming on his brow. "We're in a dive. We need to pull up now." The passengers screamed as the cabin tilted sharply. Flight attendants clung to whatever they could as overhead compartments burst open, luggage tumbling out. The aircraft continued its deadly descent, Malaga's coastline rushing toward them. The question that burned in Lowe's mind was, what had caused this? The cockpit of Thompson Fly 3894 was a battlefield. The Boeing 737 was in freefall, diving uncontrollably toward the Earth. Captain Richard Lowe's hands were locked onto the control yoke, his muscles straining against an unseen force that refused to release its grip on the aircraft. Beside him, First Officer Daniel Scott frantically worked the switches, his eyes darting between the instruments and the darkening sky outside. Altitude, 15,000 feet. Dropping fast. Come on, pull up. Lowe gritted his teeth, pulling back with all his strength, but the yoke felt stiff, unyielding. The aircraft was trapped in a nose-down attitude, plunging toward the Mediterranean Sea. Daniel's voice was hoarse with tension. We might have a stabilizer trim failure. We need to cut it out. Lowe barely had time to process before another jolt rocked the aircraft. The airframe groaned under the strain, and the cockpit filled with the chaotic symphony of alarms. Stall. Warning, overspeed, terrain, terrain. Passengers in the cabin were in full panic. Screams echoed through the fuselage as the sensation of freefall sent stomachs lurching. Some clung to their armrests with white-knuckled grips. Others prayed, their voices drowned by the chaos. Altitude, 12,000 feet, still dropping. Lowe's breath was coming fast, his mind racing through emergency procedures. Trim failure, manual override, stabilizer cutout. Flipping the stabilizer cutout, Daniel yelled, reaching for the switches. His fingers flipped the two small switches, cutting power to the electric trim system. If the stabilizer had gone rogue, this was their only chance to stop it. For a second, just a brief second, the plane hesitated, as if deciding whether to obey. Then, ever so slightly, the controls loosened. Lowe pulled back again. Hard. Come on, you bastard! The Boeing 737 shuddered violently. The nose inched upward, fighting the invisible force that had nearly sent them plummeting to their deaths. The G-forces pressed them into their seats as the plane slowly leveled out. Altitude, 8,000 feet. Daniel exhaled sharply. We're pulling up. In the cabin, passengers felt the aircraft lift, the crushing weight in their stomachs easing slightly. Cries of fear turned to gasps of relief, though the tension was still thick in the air. Lowe wasn't celebrating just yet. We're not out of the woods. I need full control. Daniel scanned the instruments. Hydraulics are still responding. We might have manual control now, but we need to be careful. Lowe nodded, his grip firm. We're heading back to Malaga. Get ATC on the line. Daniel switched frequencies, his voice steady but urgent. Mayday, 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 Thompson 3894. We have experienced severe control issues. Request immediate return to Malaga. We need priority landing. The response was immediate. Thompson 3894. You are cleared for emergency landing. Runway 13 is open, wind at 10 knots, visibility clear. Do you require assistance? Lowe took a deep breath. We'll let you know. For now, just get us on the ground. The aircraft stabilized at 5,000 feet, shaking slightly but holding steady. Lowe guided it carefully, his hands still trembling from the sheer force he had used to regain control. The once routine flight had turned into a nightmare. And as Malaga's runway lights came into view, one thought remained in their minds. What had caused this? And could it happen again?